Hello and welcome to Aging Well with 50 Forward and Dr. Amy Price Neff from Mindstream Integrative Medicine. I'm Kelsey Mahaffey, the All of Us Project Director for 50 Forward, located in Nashville, Tennessee. Today's program is brought to you by 50 Forward, a national community engagement partner for the All of Us Research Program, which is a research program from the National Institutes of Health to help advance precision medicine. All of Us is seeking 1 million people from diverse backgrounds living in the United States to volunteer and share their health data, helping researchers find better treatments and cures for all of us. Over 680,000 have enrolled so far, and you can learn more by visiting our website at joinallofus.org/50forward. With me also today is Dr. Amy Price Neff and Keith Richardson, 50 Forward All of Us Outreach Coordinator. Welcome, Dr. Amy, and hello, Keith.
Hi, Kelsey, and hello, and welcome, Dr. Neff, and a big welcome to all of you watching today. Our topic today is the healing power of psychedelics. May sound surprising to some, but in recent years, the use of psychedelics as treatment for certain conditions, including alcoholism, depression, and PTSD, has gained more traction. This past January, the National Institutes of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism formed a group to discuss basic, clinical, and translational research related to psychedelics. Additionally, the National Library of Medicine recently published an article that explored the relationship between microdosing and participants' self-perceived benefits of mental health and addiction. So what's all the buzz about? We're interested to learn more as welcome as our special guest, Dr. Amy Price Neff, who has put together a presentation on this topic. For those watching on Facebook, you can place any questions in the comment section on your screen, and we will do our best to address them at the end. Dr. Neff, welcome back, and as always, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to join you all today. And I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to talk about psychedelic medicines. It's kind of easy in this current landscape of news media to feel maybe like there's a lot of buzz and hype. And especially when we're talking about something as serious as medication, we really need to kind of get into a frame of, not necessarily, I think maybe we got to meet in the middle. Like we got to meet in the middle around, we're not often talking about medications in a light way because the conditions that we're treating are serious, and when it comes to things like psychedelic medicines, it's easy to joke about it, like, because there are people that use these medicines recreationally, meaning they're using it, to kind of like just have fun. And I want to strike that middle ground of, maybe letting go of some myths, and then also introducing some of the why, like why are we even talking about it and why has it gotten a toehold? So let me get my screen shared. Let's see, what do I want to share my Chrome? There we go. Okay, and then I can get the big slideshow going. So how does that look, folks? Good, great. Okay, well, so what is it? Today's August 4th. We're going to be talking about psychedelic medicines. And I have a picture here of some different mushrooms, most of those not being the kind that you would actually take. Some of these, yes, more serious. And that leads me to kind of like a first opportunity to put a little caveat in there, which is that, Middle Tennessee right now, as humid as it is filled with mushrooms. And the mushrooms that we're talking about are not the ones that you can just like necessarily go out and find when you're walking at Percy Warner Park. So we'll talk a little bit more, as we get through the conversation, just about, making sure that you know what you're doing when you choose to take a psychedelic medication. So without further ado, let's jump in a little bit. The conversation around psychedelics has to start with culture. So, we didn't just come up with these things in the last 100 years. The human species has been using psychedelic medications with evidence from the archaeological record for millennia. And so we have things like these mushroom stones that are big, right? They're approximately a foot tall, from South American culture. We have evidence dating back 12,000 years to Western Asia of bodies being buried with psychedelic inducing substances. Here we have a picture of Maria Sabina, who was a curandero, a medicine woman from Oaxaca, who was the first person that a gentleman named Gordon Wasson, a financier from New York, met when he went to Mexico and had an experience of psychedelic medicines in the 1950s. And his piece about that was written up in this issue of Life magazine, May 13th of 1957. So, psychedelics entered American consciousness, around the beginning of the 20th century. And the arrival of psychedelic medicines came with even just an awareness of what consciousness is. It wasn't until the late 1800s that we had philosophers and kind of the advent of the field of psychiatry, from basically started by an American physician named William James. His brother was a novelist, Henry James. And so by the mid 50s, here in the top of the screen here, you see Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who would go on to change his name and become a gentleman named Ram Dass. These were two Harvard researchers who did a lot of experimentation with LSD. And, some would say somewhat critically that the research that they did ended up causing the psychedelic movement to get a little bit of a kind of a mainstream social critique. Okay. And whether it was Timothy Leary and his kind of like outlandish tactics and kind of like moon suits that he would wear, or as you can see here, Richard Nixon and Elvis Presley meeting together and kind of talking about what would become the war on drugs. Psychedelics ended up having an experience in Western medicine is very different from other consciousness altering medicines that we use routinely in healthcare. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of psychedelic research. Now, I mentioned already that psychedelics have been used culturally as healing substances in a variety of situations. We have evidence from Greece, we have evidence from Asia, we have evidence from South America, the Native American cultures, and Nordic cultures. I mean, basically everybody used psychedelics. But it wasn't until, as I mentioned here in the 1870s, William James started his writings about the nature of religious experience. So he's starting to kind of use language about like a profound experience, and then later at the end of the 19th century, a German researcher named Arthur Hefter isolates mescaline from a peyote mushroom. And then in 1912, MDMA was synthesized by a gentleman working for Merck, the chemical company that we still buy drugs from today. In 1938, Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD. He would go on to have a really strong voice in the history of psychedelic research starting in Europe, but then also coming over here. By the 50s, by the end of the 40s, early 50s, LSD was being used. Let me correct myself. LSD started to be used towards the end of the 50s, but once it started to be used, it was used pretty regularly. And there's the awareness, for instance, that Bill W., who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, based a lot of his philosophy around AA on a psychedelic experience, just giving over one's power to a higher power. And a lot of the language of the 12 steps is stuff that for people who've done psychedelic research and then in the kind of the story of Bill W., him naming that psychedelic experience as the inspiration for the 12 steps is really interesting. And it's a story that got lost largely through the 70s, 80s, and the war on drugs, because it would have delegitimized that approach. I do want to kind of really specifically point out that in the early 1950s towards the end of the 70s, the CIA and the US military conducted research on psychedelics basically as a chemical warfare tool. And there are even people here in Nashville who were soldiers that were part of these experiments. And it was not a very positive experience to be, forced to take psychedelic medicines and then sent out on a battlefield simulator. And so I just want to kind of name that the history of the psychedelic research is also kind of it's kind of the dirty laundry of medical research in general. When we advance into the 60s, in the early 60s, ketamine was synthesized by a guy named Anthony Domino. And in 1964, ketamine was first tested in humans on prisoners at Jackson State Prison. And so those, obviously weren't consenting people. But again, it's just one of those deep negatives. And so I think that between the war on drugs and the history of medical research in general, psychedelics really kind of has a lot going against it in terms of acceptability to most people. That haven't had drug experiences or, any curiosity about consciousness alteration. So kind of getting into like deeper research, what I can tell you about the last 20 plus years in the US is that psychedelic medicines were established through good clinical research in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s as effective tools to treat several different conditions. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance use disorders, existential dread. And probably the bulk of the research, even back then, was in cancer patients, because cancer patients in particular face a steep task, a steep, mission in terms of being okay with whatever's going on. And the reason that the research continued at such a clip was because of the effectiveness that they were coming up with in clinical trials. So we'll get a little bit more into that later in our conversation. So let me just get first into kind of like, what are these things? How many of them are there? And like, what are we really talking about? So, there are probably hundreds of different plants that you can take that alter your consciousness. One that most of us have an experience with probably on a daily basis is the coffee bean. So caffeine has some consciousness altering properties, and it's pleasant, right? It helps us get stuff done. So in the same way that you might have a relationship with a coffee plant, I want to invite you into this idea that other plants have these profound effects on our nervous system and can be used medicinally. So what you can see here in the center is a painting that really depicts like a native culture, and really this is the kind of a vast alternative to what, if you could imagine, like going to the doctor looks like for you now, right? So here we have a big group of people. We have, someone in that red robe that's clearly like they're beating a drum and they're maybe kind of like cultivating the sense of space. This is how healing was done for millennia. And I don't think that healing as was practiced for multiple millennia was ineffective. Might have been different than what we experience or expect, but I think one thing that we have done that's probably not that helpful in Western medicine is we've taken the community out of the healing experience. So, well, I have a whole slide dedicated to kind of vocabulary coming up, because this whole world of plant medicines has its own language. And, basically I want to kind of start with this word entheogen. Entheogen is just a Greek word that means, it's kind of the formation of two different ancient Greek words, entheos and genesthai, basically meaning full of God, inspired, or possessed. And it also forms the root word of the English word enthusiasm. And, historically throughout the archaeological record, psychedelic medicines were used in a ritualized fashion. These were not like party drugs that the communities would just do like to like have fun. They were very contextualized, and typically involved community. So there are places that you can go, for instance, now in countries like Peru, where the user, the consumer, the kind of the participant in these rituals is invited to basically share in an ancient tradition with a shaman leading the experience, and it's done in a group. And so a lot of Americans have taken those companies up on this type of psychedelic travel because it's not available here in the United States, although that is actually changing as states move to decriminalize these plant medicines. This is one of my favorite quotes. Quanah Parker was the son of a famous horse tribe chieftain and a white woman who had been kidnapped at a young age and from a fort in Texas. And Quanah rose to the ranks of being a really tremendous political leader in the United States back around the turn of the 20th century. He had presidents come to his house. He's a very inspirational guy. And if you have not heard of Quanah Parker or read anything about him, I invite you to do so. But listen to what he says. The white man goes into his church house and talks about Jesus. The Indian goes into his teepee and talks to Jesus. And, this is going to be a theme that we kind of come back to just in terms of like how different the psychedelic experience or the approach is compared to our traditional, maybe more rigid approaches. So let's go through some terms, first of all, kind of starting with the term psychoactive. So as I've already mentioned, caffeine for many people, depending on the dose, can become a psychoactive substance, meaning you notice that you've consumed it. Maybe you feel a little coffee buzz. Similarly, other psychoactive medications, if anybody has had to take a pain medication, there can be psychoactive properties to different medications. Psychedelic is a word that means expansion of consciousness from the words psyche and delune, psyche meaning the soul and delune meaning to make visible or to reveal. The next word is empathogen. So empathogen means generating a state of empathy. And while this was a word that was coined in the recent past to kind of denote a particular class of psychoactive medications that really make you feel connected, there is an alternative word because empathy and empathos, sometimes people hear pathology or negative. And so there's a whole nother kind of group of people that would rather we said enactogen, meaning producing a touching within. A dissociative is basically just a perception distorter, an experience in which one feels detached. And then hallucinogens basically come from the Latin, which means to wander in the mind. So this is a busy slide, and I just want to kind of start by saying that the take-home messages I think are really useful for anybody contemplating how we currently treat mental health issues. So in the blue part of this slide, what we're looking at is the part of the brain that medications, traditional antidepressants, are designed to target. So this central part of the brain is also known as the primitive brain. And this primitive brain is what kind of flares when we experience something that just kind of like really gets us. And so you can think about people who have really intense anxiety or, you know, deep depression where they're kind of like coming in, you know, and really kind of shutting down. And the intention and the design of these medications is basically to blunt that either wild kind of like limbic response where you're like, you know, I'm anxious, or I'm like agitated or angry or impulsive or, you know, really depressed. And these medicines work by blunting it. Okay. So for very good reasons, blunting some of those terrible feelings is not a bad strategy. But the problem over the long term is that this blunting and kind of like suppression of these things makes the person who's taking that medication, it just makes the whole kind of psychic experience more rigid, less flexible, more blunt. And so when we take care of patients that take antidepressants, a very common problem in people taking antidepressants is that they don't have access to their feelings. They're like, something important happens, they're like, meh. Something bad happens, they're like, meh, you know. And it's a reason that people will often, you know, want to start talking about not taking the medicines. And now we can contrast that with this different approach, which is the psychedelic medicine approach. And so you can see basically through this slide that the different receptor that the medicines work on is just all over the brain. And the action is not like a blunting effect. In fact, sometimes it can make people feel those feelings even more. However, and I'll show you another slide in a second just to kind of demonstrate like what we exactly mean, but basically these medicines help the brain to resource and be more resilient and kind of like maybe learn that the experience that one is having is not going to overwhelm. It's like that there's enough bandwidth within the system to handle it, right? So what we're doing is with these medicines, it's pretty clear it's increasing flexibility. It's increasing the ability to learn and adapt and change, as opposed to becoming more and more and more rigid. So this is basically like a mathematical representation of what that resourcing of the mind looks like. So over here in letter A, we've kind of like a mathematical representation of how the brain typically talks to itself. And these different colors would be regions of the brain that are largely just sharing information kind of like within and amongst themselves. You can think about this as like, you know, like each one of these might be a different state of the union, right? And not really working with other states, okay? And then when we come over here to B, so this is basically a mathematical model of the brain of a person before they took psilocybin and after they took psilocybin. And what you can see is this crazy expansion of crosstalk, of different regions talking not just within themselves, like there's clearly more conversation going on within the groups, but it's also cross-communicating. It's getting across the brain. And so you have a lot of bandwidth in your brain. But as we get older, that childlike mind that's kind of like so open and receptive to everything starts to become more rigid just naturally. And the psychedelics appear to really just kind of like take the crust off the rigidity and resource the mind. So I want to kind of pivot to just a conversation while, you know, in the time that we have about ketamine, because ketamine is that legal and currently available in Nashville psychedelic that we use kind of like philosophically in the ways that I've been telling you about so far. So, you know, first of all, like you may have noticed, advertisements for ketamine clinics, or an awareness, and maybe even like friends or family that have gone to a ketamine clinic, or you've gone yourself. And it's a little bit weird, I have to admit. I mean, there are these places and they're offering packages and discounts, and it's almost like the weight loss clinic of the 90s is the ketamine clinic of the 2020s. But I want to kind of invite that, consumers are they're not idiots, right? And the reason that there's a demand for treatments like this is that they can be effective, and that what people currently are getting is people are increasingly less interested in, and what I'm talking about is like just the traditional antidepressants. So let's talk a little bit about ketamine. So this is Brigitte Bardot, the French actress. And, one of my favorite stories about ketamine is that, it has been known as a drug of abuse. But in general, it is one of, and listed by the World Health Organization as one of the most important medications for humankind. It's used in operating rooms around the world every day. And then it's increasingly used to treat mood disorders. But because of its potential abuse potential, Vladimir Putin, back around 2010, decided that ketamine was not legal in Russia. And it's also an incredibly important medication for veterinary use. And so Brigitte Bardot appealed personally to Vladimir Putin to make ketamine legal again. And he did. But let me go back and tell you a little bit of the backstory. So I mentioned earlier in the history of psychedelic research that ketamine was synthesized in the early 60s. And the purpose of that drug was to be an anesthetizing agent that could be used without the need to intubate. So you can imagine how complex it is to intubate somebody and have to support their breathing while you're operating on them. And this was going to be an alternative to that, which would make access to surgical care across the globe much easier. And in fact, it's done that. Because of how effective it was and because of the low side effect profile, it was quickly used in the Vietnam era as something called a buddy drug. And so if you were going out in Vietnam with, and under fire, and you got hit, your buddy could administer this drug, and it would, it basically lowered the death rate of GIs that were injured on the battlefield by 50% over Korea. So this had a tremendous impact on troop morale in Vietnam. But it also was what prompted the Vietnam, soldiers to coin the term the K-hole, because ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic. So when you get an injected into you, you basically it kind of detaches your brain from your body, in terms of your consciousness. And it is a very intense experience, depending on the dose that you take. So essentially, it's been used very consistently since the late 60s in human health. Towards the end of the 70s, it was doctors in places like Egypt and Iran that were using this medication for surgical procedures who started to notice that their patients were less depressed. And it was then that kind of the line of inquiry started. Is this something that could actually help with any mood issues? And around the early 2000s was when the clinical trials were finally starting to be done in the US about ketamine and mood. And the bottom line regarding ketamine and mood is that for people that complete a series of ketamine injections with diagnoses such as alcohol use disorder, depression, major depression, treatment-resistant depression, generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, 80% of the people get at least 50% better. 80%. And that's compared to traditional antidepressant medications, which is something between 35 and 45%. So it's almost twice as effective. And then about 60% of people that have a ketamine series actually go on to no longer meet the criteria for the diagnosis that they've presented with. So it's really for this reason, the therapeutic effectiveness, that I became convinced that I needed to train in it because, I treat people with depression. So let's talk a little bit about a ketamine experience. So this is my office. This is where a patient would come and kind of sit in a recliner. What you see in the picture is, a recliner. You see the little orange device with the wire coming out of it is an oxygen monitor. So we measure people's oxygen levels during the session. You see a blanket. Here, it's a little bit hard to tell, but this is a set of eye shades and a set of headphones. And so when we give the medication, the whole experience lasts about an hour. We typically give it as an injection in the arm. And physically, what a person experiences that very quickly, somewhere between typically with the injections, is between 2 and 5 minutes, your kind of level of consciousness is changing. And you might notice kind of physically, like the heart kind of pounding a little bit. Sometimes people sweat a little bit or have like a little bit of like involuntary twitching. About 80% of people have a very deeply relaxing experience. That leaves about 20% of people that are often moving, kind of very physical in their experiences. Less so with the injectables. Sometimes with oral ketamine, people can get somewhat nauseous. And then, especially because I work here in Nashville and people are musicians and very sensitive about their hearing, sometimes it can make some ringing in the ears happen. And then just perceptually, what can happen is I like to think about ketamine as basically affecting all 5 senses. So sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. Every person is going to have a different experience of what sensory modality the ketamine works with kind of the most on with them. But it can be everything from just feeling really euphoric or feeling like you're just seeing dreamlike things, feeling like you're floating, hearing, or, having a sense of movement. And then just psychically feel like a hallucination, maybe hearing something that isn't there, seeing something that isn't there, a little bit of a question, is this real? Is this not real? And then often too, just very profoundly intense emotional feelings, anxiousness, or just a deep sense of connection. And again, this all happens kind of like under this arc of the medication, which lasts about an hour. And you can see here, like my little chair, we do this in such a way where we don't leave people alone. We feel like there's an opportunity. Let's say after getting ketamine, one felt really intensely anxious. Having a person there just to kind of cajole, reassure is very healing. Oftentimes that anxiety is actually a mirror to an experience perhaps in childhood where someone got really anxious, but there was nobody there to help. And so the healing experience for the body and nervous system is just to have support when needed. So, I said in the beginning, I really want to make sure that people understand that these things, they're helpful, they're very effective, but they're not perfect. Okay. So for instance, with ketamine, there are things, medical conditions, not too many, but there are medical conditions that would keep us from being able to use that medicine. And there are psychiatric conditions that would keep us from being able to use the medicine. So we can't give this medicine to someone that is actively psychotic or actively manic or actively deeply involved in substance use where they might have a withdrawal experience, or someone who's not able to consent. And then it's also important, kind of like in a less absolute way, but relatively, you can think about all psychedelic medicines as being a destabilizing experience, where you're having these like really intense experiences and you kind of want to come out, but not necessarily have to do a lot of intense stuff right after. We want the kind of the experience to have some time to be metabolized. And so for people with limited social support or, or lots of conflict in relationships, if they come out of this experience and then kind of immediately go into either isolation or stress, that's not very helpful. So these are the kinds of medications that require more planning and support in order to have a reasonable experience. I want to just kind of talk about the practicals of this. As you're aware, so psychedelics like psilocybin, MDMA, they are not legal in Tennessee, and they're still being used, like by a lot of people and often, and in different parts of the country. They are decriminalized, meaning people don't face any jail time for using them. Because of the evidence for their use in the cancer world, for instance, patients that are affected by really intense fear of dying are very interested in these therapeutic modalities. And so there's a way for patients who plan on using a psychedelic to have a good kind of preparation and medical evaluation, just to make sure that they're a right fit for this. So this is a picture of my cousin Jackie. And Jackie was an incredible businesswoman, and she was a PhD chemist from MIT and ran a company that coached Fortune 500 leaders on how to be more empathic in the workplace. And unfortunately, when Jackie's kids were teenagers, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And it was a really tough blow. Because I look at this woman, it's like, this was like a mover and a shaker and a really incredible person. And yet her body had other plans, it was doing other things. And at some point she was really just filled with the dread of dying. And I didn't work with her on this, but she was a story that she shared with me that while she lived in a state where psychedelics weren't legal, she understood enough about the chemistry of it and the effectiveness that she decided that it was a good fit for her to help her with her existential dread. And what she came to understand was that it's not a magic bullet, an outcome wasn't guaranteed, that she had a lot of different medications that she was taking that she needed to change in order to have a good experience. And she also learned that she needed to have a trained therapist or guide help her during her experience. She is very kind of organized, was a very organized woman, and she got all that stuff in place. And then she took psilocybin and she said she laughed for 5 hours straight. And that, for someone that was really significantly impacted by metastatic cancer, was a phenomenal gift. And so, as you can see, it was not a straightforward path to doing that. She had help and support along the way, and fundamentally it improved her experience towards the end of her life. Let's talk a little bit about legalization and decriminalization. So in our country right now, and this is as of November 2022, we're talking specifically about psilocybin here. In the state of Oregon and in the state of Colorado, efforts have been passed legislatively to make psilocybin legal. There is still a framework around how it gets used. It's not just like a free-for-all, but it is legalized. And then there are other states where these changes are starting to take place. So in the state of Maryland, in the state of Texas, in the state of Utah, these states are actively considering legalization. There have been states such as California and Oklahoma where it's being passed in one way or another. Hawaii is also looking at it. And this is going to probably look very similar to medical cannabis use, where on a state-by-state basis, there are decisions that are made to change the state's kind of consideration of these medications. So currently, according to the Federal Drug Administration, the FDA, psilocybin and MDMA are considered Schedule I drugs, meaning that they have no benefit or use in human health. But as we know that's actually not true. And so the FDA is undergoing a process to reschedule these medications based on FDA-approved clinical trials that have established safety, dosing, and effectiveness. So just to wrap up, I want to kind of go through some take-home points. Psychedelic medications are effective, and they involve two things. They involve medication plus a therapist or guide. We call that psychedelic-assisted therapy. And evidence across different diagnoses, from mental health disorders to the existential dread of facing a serious chronic illness, the evidence is very strong to support the use of this approach. Just for ketamine, we talked about like the medical absolute and relative contraindications. And I think what that points to is like, you can't just do this like without a careful screening process. When we use them, I showed you a picture of my office. We have a lot of work that we have to do to kind of cultivate the right mindset to go into a medication experience. And we have to cultivate a good setting where someone who's essentially kind of like consciously out the door has a safe place for their body to be while they're doing that. We talked a little bit about the legal framework, decriminalization versus legalization, and how that looks very different across the state or across the country. For instance, in Tennessee, there is no legal psychedelic except for ketamine, which is considered by the medical community to be an anesthetic. Psychedelic assisted therapy is useful not only for people with serious illness, but also their families, caregivers, and loved ones. Because if you have been affected by serious illness or are a family member or loved one, that is an experience that involves a lot of feelings. Therapists and facilitators that practice psychedelic assisted therapy have to have special training. And this is a skill set that's beyond a typical Western provider. My training that I undertook just to be able to provide ketamine assisted therapy was a year long. It's incumbent upon providers of this to honor the indigenous traditions. We talked about culture and people like Maria Sabina, like from the very beginning of this talk, because it's important to not co-opt, longstanding cultural traditions and act like we just invented this here in Western medicine. People respond to psychedelics in a highly variable way, and we have to expect the unexpected whenever we're using a medication like this. And I would say fundamentally, you have to expect that it might not work or it might make things worse. And that's a really important take-home point. And then allowing for an inner-directed approach. That basically means like within psychedelic assisted therapy, we don't tell people how to feel better. We encourage people to kind of like bring their own healing intelligence and wisdom with just intentional support to the healing process. So that's my talk today. I think I stopped my share. There we go. Yeah, so I just want to invite any questions that people might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neff. This is just a fascinating dive into the world of psychedelics as possible treatment for those suffering. That's what you as a doctor are here to solve, the suffering from those that are experience certain conditions. So I can see why more research on this should be undertaken, that it's really quite necessary. So anyone on Facebook, if you have a question about psychedelics or anything Dr. Neff has presented on today, or any questions about the All of Us research program, feel free to drop those in the comment section on Facebook. We don't have a ton of time today, but while we're waiting to see if anybody watching has a question, I'll jump in with a question of my own, because I wrote down notes like I always do when you're on here, Dr. Neff, and you mentioned good clinical research, which I love that. And how do we get to that place of good clinical research for psychedelics? And you mentioned there are clinical trials happening now. Is that all across the country? Is there, if somebody wanted to participate in a clinical trial, is there somewhere they could go for that?
Those are great questions. So what does good clinical research mean? Basically, in doing research, we have to eliminate as much bias as possible. So you can imagine that me as a researcher, if I really believe that ketamine is going to really fix somebody, then my bias would be to interpret everything that I see under the kind of awareness that it's working. And if I see something that's not working, I might be inclined to believe that that's an outlier, except that sometimes the outlier would be more common than the effectiveness, right? And so basically, I don't want to go too deeply into kind of like the ways that we eliminate bias in medical research, but it's an important thing, and just like all of us is doing, one of the most important ways to eliminate bias is to have a very diverse group of people that you're studying, so that we can make sure that it's not simply a feature of a certain socioeconomic, racial, class, gender, or other kind of health behaviors type individual that's going to respond. And then with regard to clinical trials, so there are literally hundreds of clinical trials going on right now all across the globe using psychedelics because of the potential effectiveness. As far as getting involved in clinical trials, the closest place that I know of is a research facility in Knoxville. And so one of the barriers is clearly getting there. And typical clinical trials with psychedelics are multiple visits. And then the psychedelic experience, for instance, with ketamine, I said that, it's an hour long, but the appointment time I have with someone might be 2.5 hours. And, you have to have a ride, there's a lot of kind of like clunkiness to being able to have a psychedelic experience. Psilocybin would be an all-day event. The medication from start to finish takes about 6 hours, and the getting ready and then kind of wrapping up at the end, it's typically an 8-hour day in those clinical trials. And then like I said, with the therapeutic presence, it involves not just presence while you're under the medicine, but also before and after. So preparing for an experience and then integrating what you experienced into your life, right? Just kind of like getting some guidance and therapeutic support in determining like maybe some insights that have arrived, like new understandings.
Awesome. I do have a question for you, Dr. Neff. Great presentation, by the way. Where do you see the use of psychedelics probably in the next 5 to 10 years? Do you feel like more medical professionals will catch on and start using it?
Yeah, great question, Keith. I do feel like things will change probably for what most people feel like is at a rapid clip. So sometime in the next 2 years, MDMA and psilocybin will be rescheduled, and they will become available for people like myself, medical professionals, to use clinically in every state. So if the FDA decides to reschedule MDMA and psilocybin, we won't have to wait for the state legislatures to legalize it or decriminalize it, because it will then become a medical drug. In the same way that opioids are not legal or decriminalized from a law enforcement perspective, but they are medical pharmaceutical agents that I can prescribe as a licensed physician, right? And so what that might look like is, and this is sticky. This is really sticky, actually. When the FDA approves these drugs, there will be pharmaceutical companies that have invested and created companies or structures around which to sell those drugs. And it's anybody's guess still what they're going to charge for these drugs. And, you know, just as a practical person that treats real people with budgets, if there's a legal way to get a drug that might cost $30,000 or a non-legal way to get a drug, the same drug, and it might cost $1,000, you know, I mean, I just have practical concerns about how that's going to look, you know. I mean, and one could say the same thing about, you know, getting fentanyl or heroin on the streets. I mean, you know, that fentanyl is a medication that's used in healthcare every day. But it's used more, not necessarily because people want it on the streets, because it's a cheap opioid. Yeah, so in the next 3 to 5 years, I think you can expect to be able to go to a doctor's office like mine and have an MDMA experience.
Okay, awesome. We do have a question from one of our Facebook viewers. I'm going to just read this real quick.
Mhm.
This is from Susan. She says, how do you know if a provider or clinic is safe? Is there licensing someone
Mm.
should seek, or questions those seeking help should ask?
That's a great question too. So there are multiple centers across the country now that are training people in psychedelic medicines. So places like Johns Hopkins has a psychedelic research unit, New York University has one, UCLA, San Francisco. So major academic centers are training people in the use of psychedelic medicines. I think that Susan, the question that you asked though is really important, because if you walk into a medical practice and you start talking about psychedelic medicines with a healthcare provider that has not been educated or aware of the literature on this, you might be met with a strong opinion in the negative. And I think that, you know, hopefully here in 2023, one could at least say, you know, I'm pretty, you know, that I've heard that these things are effective, and I'd like to ask more questions about it. I think, you know, and hopefully if that clinician, just like, you know, I'm not a cardiologist. If I have complex cardiology questions coming at me, I'm going to like try to set somebody up with a specialist, you know, in cardiology. And so there are credentials and training that one could ultimately ask about. So for instance, I've done a year-long training in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and I'm a member of the American Society of Ketamine Prescribers and Practitioners. And there's another training from the multidisciplinary action. What does MAPS stand for? I'm just going to not know that one. But MAPS is the agency, a nonprofit that has brought MDMA research to bear. And MAPS has a certification. And I have mostly completed the steps to be MAPS certified. So those are the questions that one could ask about training and certification.
And I think too, as a follow-up to that, this will be our last question just due to time. I know, Dr. Amy, you've probably got to go. But if somebody was interested in this, pursuing this and for their own mental health, kind of the question is, what would be step one? What should they do? Where would they go?
Good question. So I think step one, you have to be careful what information you get on the internet. And so I just want to kind of like encourage people. I always enjoy when people do their own research, but really it might be research that leads you to develop a list of questions. And then there are several entities locally that you could go to ask questions about psychedelic medicine. There's the Nashville Psychedelic Center, NPC, which is trained therapists who provide ketamine-assisted therapy. There's also Trauma Therapy of Nashville, another practice that is trained in the provision of psychedelic medicine. There are several other therapists locally, medical practices like mine that offer ketamine, as well as helping people understand the harms and risks if they are choosing to do psychedelic medicines that are not currently legal here in Tennessee.
Awesome. All right. Well, I do believe our time is up for today. Dr. Neff, once again, we really do thank you so much for these very enlightening conversations that you have with us on Fridays. Just thank you. Wonderful presentations, and we hope that our viewers also learn something as well too. And just a little plug, please be sure to come out for our Walk with the Doc, which happens next week on Wednesday at Centennial Park, and it's at 10 a.m. at the Pavilion Shelter. I am wearing a Walk with the Doc shirt, so we definitely would love to come and have you out. So
Yes. Thanks, Keith. Thanks for that reminder.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Dr. Neff. This has just been fascinating. I'm looking forward to rewatching this. I love those slides that you shared. I've even read a book and I've learned something watching here. So I love this.
Great.
So those of you watching, if you would like to learn more about the All of Us research program, please just remember you can always visit our website, which is www.joinallofus.org/50forward. And you can learn how you can become 1 in a million with All of Us if you're interested in joining almost 700,000 people across the nation that have joined the program so far. So thank you all to tuning in for our presentation today. And I hope all of you have a great rest of the day. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
All across the country, people are coming together to speed up what we can learn about health. The All of Us research program is calling on 1 million people to join us as we try to change the future of health. For your family, for future generations, for all of us. Visit joinallofus.org and find out how you can become 1 in a million.